Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up, as the Biden administration redoubles efforts to secure a ceasefire in Lebanon, might Israel struggle to get more support from the US Senate?
As Americans, we are complicit. That is why I am now leading the effort in the Senate to block additional offensive arms sales to Israel.
Ukraine uses long-range missiles for the first time, with Russia responding by redrafting its nuclear policy. Saber-rattling or a serious concern? Then, protesters perform hackers while marching alongside thousands through Wellington. We'll have the latest on the controversial bill they're demonstrating against. Plus the day's papers, the latest theatre news, and why Japan is struggling to meet matcha demand. That's ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. President Biden has agreed to give Ukraine anti-personnel landmines in an attempt to slow Russian troops who've been steadily advancing across eastern regions over recent months. Jimmy Lai, one of Hong Kong's most influential pro-democracy figures, is taking the stand today in a national security trial that may see him sentenced to life imprisonment. And Rafael Nadal's illustrious 20-year tennis career has come to an end, as Spain lost to the Netherlands in an emotional Davis Cup match on Tuesday night. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, US envoy Amos Hochstein says there is a real opportunity to bring the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel to an end as he visits Lebanon to discuss a ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, Israel has discovered Hezbollah has been in possession of troves of Russian weaponry, and it's facing a vote in the US Senate on its own supplies. To discuss this, we're joined by Leila Malana-Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent, and Michael Binion, foreign affairs specialist for The Times. Leila, firstly, are these ceasefire talks a last-ditch wishful thinking attempt by the outgoing Biden administration, or do they have a real chance at a Hail Mary pass here?
They are a last-ditch attempt, but everyone really had thought, well, there's no way this is going through. Israeli officials have absolutely no reason to agree to a ceasefire right now when the administration is going to change in 2 months. And it looks like the Trump administration that's incoming is going to be even more friendly towards Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his two-front war now. But suddenly, as of yesterday, it does appear that things with these ceasefire talks are on the up. Hochstein had said that he now would not be going back to Lebanon again until he was sure that he could push the ceasefire through. He did then travel back yesterday after a bit of umming and ahhing. What happened was that he sat with Nabih Berri, who is the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, who's been endorsed by Hezbollah to negotiate on their behalf. And what's very clear is how much Lebanon and Hezbollah want a ceasefire. The country really is being decimated. Villages and towns across the south completely flattened, much of the southern suburbs of Beirut flattened. 3,500 people are now dead, 15,000 people injured. They are desperate to bring this war to an end. So they're certainly very interested in pushing this ceasefire through. And they've essentially sent back the terms to Hochstein to take to Israel today, saying that they essentially just have 4 questions they want resolved. The main sticking point really is Lebanon's territorial integrity. Israel wants to have the right to enter mainly Lebanese airspace, but also part of the territory in the south whenever it feels like it, to enforce what it calls in this clause its right to self-defense. And the question is over that, how regularly and to what extent it can incur into Lebanese airspace and what that would mean for Lebanese territory and how long that would last, because, of course, many people are very afraid of another occupation in the south of Lebanon that reflects what happened at the end of the Civil War, where Israel occupied Lebanon until 2000, when it finally pulled out. So everything from that side is very positive. The other concern on the Lebanese side is whether Israel actually is endorsing this ceasefire. They are concerned. They say that they've seen in the past they were involved in negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza, and that Israeli authorities then changed the game there, changed the terms several times. They want confirmation and a guarantee from American officials that they promise that Israeli officials have actually endorsed this deal. So that's what Hochstein will be looking for as well from that side. The main focus here is whether or not they will re-push for Resolution 1701, which ended the last war at the end of 2006. Which essentially says three things: that Hezbollah will withdraw from southern Lebanon behind the Litani River, that the Lebanese armed forces will take control there, and that Israel will respect the blue line, which is the border between Lebanon and Israel. America still says that this UN resolution is the way forward, and they want to reinstate it. They want to push harder with a new mechanism to make that happen. They want to put together a committee led by a US general to support UN peacekeepers and the Lebanese armed forces in the south when Hezbollah does withdraw, which it now says it will. The Lebanese armed forces, who know the American military is very pro-Israel, would prefer for that to be led by an American diplomat from the State Department who might be more neutral, they feel. But so these sticking points are what are being wrangled out. But we are looking at potentially a lot more positive of a chance of this going through than it seemed a few days ago.
And Michael, if I can bring you in, Israel is said to have found Russian weaponry manufactured as recently as 2020 in Hezbollah's arsenal. How might it have got there, and what will that do for Israel's relationship with Russia?
Well, almost certainly I think it would have come via Iran, because Iran has been armed by Russia and helped by Russia recently. And in particular, there have been a number of transactions between Russia and Iran, with the Iranians also helping the Russians supply drones for their war in Ukraine. So it's known that Hezbollah has very, very close military as well as political links with Iran, and in some way these weapons may have come either across the Syrian border, because there are large Iranian forces in Syria, or possibly shipped in by sea, though the Israelis would keep a very close watch on anything coming in by sea. But yes, it's not surprising that Hezbollah does have arms that have originated in Russia.
Netanyahu and Putin have obviously known each other for a long time. They've been in leadership roles for decades. They have a tempestuous relationship. Do you think there'll be any response from Israel to this?
Well, possibly, but I think the Israelis at the moment are rather feeling that they've got the upper hand. They just want things to continue. They're going to wait until President Trump comes into office, where they then feel that actually they will simply interpret the terms of whatever agreement is reached as favorably as possible to themselves. They would like to end the war, but they want to make quite sure, effectively, that they have won, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. And Netanyahu was in Gaza yesterday, inspecting where the Israeli troops were and feeling pretty pleased with what he said they had achieved.
Layla, how worried do you think Israel is about this vote in the US Senate on the next tranche of support from the military, the sort of crucial weaponry that they need?
Israel is unlikely to be concerned about this vote. So essentially what's happening is Senator Bernie Sanders has put forward a joint resolution of disapproval. This is a move against presidential policy. So what happens is that if people in the Senate, senators and those in Congress disagree with presidential policy, in this case, arms sales, they are trying to block the next $20 billion arms sale to Israel. They can put forward this motion. Now, obviously, doing so is a direct attack on presidential policy, so the president is likely to veto that. But if they can get a 2/3 vote in both the Senate and in Congress, they can actually overturn that presidential policy. This is also being supported by Senator Elizabeth Warren, but it is really unlikely given the current makeup of the houses, given the current Biden administration policy, of course, to be completely supportive of Israel in these wars. It's very, very unlikely that they'll be able to do so, but it's still an attempt to show that they are unhappy, that members of the Senate and Congress are unhappy with the way this war is being waged, what's being done with the weapons that they are sending, that the US is sending to Israel. Of course, we saw a few weeks ago, the Biden administration came forward and gave Israel an ultimatum. They said, unless you can improve the aid flow to Gaza and show that you are not obstructing it and that your method of warfare in Gaza is not obstructing people's ability to live, we will suspend some offensive arms sales to you. Nothing changed. Nothing was provided by the Israeli government. And there was then a very weak statement 30 days later on the deadline from the Biden administration saying they can't essentially really see, they can't really define whether or not they think Israel is obstructing aid. Now, that isn't the reality on the ground. US law says that The US cannot sell weapons to a country that is obstructing US-led aid efforts. And that is exactly what's happening on the ground in Gaza. But really what this comes down to is the fact that essentially this in itself is a proxy war, this regional war, right? I mean, we were just hearing about these weapons from Russia that have been found. The IDF munitions experts say that 60 to 70% of the weapons that they've uncovered in Hezbollah territory in the south of Lebanon during their ground invasion have been Russian. That's not at all surprising because, of course, Russia and Iran have been the two main funders of the war in Syria for a decade of President Assad's war there. Hezbollah ground troops funded by Iran have been the infantry that President Assad has used in that war against rebels in Syria. So both Hezbollah and Syrian forces have been being given weapons by both Iran and Russia for a decade. Many of those weapons are now simply coming across the border for Hezbollah to use in Lebanon. Many of them will have been stored for years. They will have brought them back from Syria when they came. And I've been to those border crossings between Lebanon and Syria. One's called Masna, one of the main crossings where Syrians and Lebanese are flooding back into Syria, terrified of the war in Lebanon. That's been bombed, that border crossing, because they say it's a smuggling tunnel. So we knew those weapons that were there. It's not at all surprising. But of course, this is being used as yet again another example of how Western countries see this as a wider proxy war where Iran and Russia, the two great enemies, are supporting Hezbollah and are also supporting Hamas. And, you know, Israel is the US's great white hope in the region that they want to continue supporting with weapons. So as I say, these considerations like humanitarian aid and the tens of thousands of deaths on the ground really pale in significance when compared to the kind of wider political maneuvers here. And it's very unlikely we'll see this bill go through.
And Michael, there have been strong signals from the Trump administration on its very pro-Israel policy, given the staffing appointments and their past comments. How are other governments in the region feeling, thinking about sort of Jordan, which has already taken in so many Palestinian refugees, Egypt and, you know, Saudi Arabia with MBS coming forward and using the sort of genocide word when it comes to Gaza?
Yes, of course, all the other Arab countries are extremely unhappy, very angry, but they feel that at the moment there's not much they can do to change policy in the actual fighting areas. They don't have people there, they don't have troops, obviously they're not involved, they don't want to get involved. They're hoping that the Trump administration can be swayed by, particularly by Saudi Arabia, where he had his first overseas reception in his first term and was feted and certainly was celebrated in Saudi Arabia. And that gave the Saudis a certain amount of leverage. And they're looking forward to the new coming administration, I wouldn't say with hope, but at least with some realism, feeling that at the moment, whatever the Biden administration does, it's only gesture politics and it's very unlikely to have much effect on Israel's behavior, whereas they do know that Trump probably will be able to influence Netanyahu in a way that Biden certainly couldn't.
Layla, Malana, Alan and Michael Binion there. Thank you. This is The Globalist. It's 9:14 in Kyiv and 7:14 here in London. Now, Ukraine has fired US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory for the first time, confirming Washington's tacit approval after months of petitioning. Overnight on Monday, 5 were shot down, but 1 is understood to have struck a munitions depot in the Bryansk region. There is no word yet of what was fired overnight Tuesday. Now, in response, Russia accused the United States of trying to escalate the conflict and updated its nuclear doctrine, setting out new conditions under which it would consider using its nuclear arsenal. To discuss the retching tensions, we're joined by Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. Jenny, firstly, it didn't take Ukraine long to start using these missiles, and they potentially have a limited time to do so. So what are they likely to target?
So Ukraine is going to be trying to target, first and foremost, Russia's ability to continue to wage the war. So hence an ammunitions supply area, which is apparently the target of the first missile strikes. They're also going to try to do everything they can to discourage Russian and now North Korean troops from advancing further on the territory that Ukraine holds in the Kursk region of Russia, because they want to hold on to as much of that territory as they can against the day when, possibly early in 2025, there's some sort of a ceasefire or a push towards negotiations for a longer-term sort of agreement.
And how reliant are they on the US to operate them effectively, and on sort of Western nations for intelligence on where to strike?
Well, I think this has been one of the big sort of behind-the-scenes roles that Western supporters of Ukraine have played really throughout the war, but especially now that the Ukrainians are able to use these longer-range American weapons to strike in Russia. They need the Western intelligence. They need this kind of detailed technical know-how as well in terms of where to aim those missiles. So although it's certainly the Ukrainians who are firing them, they couldn't do it without this sort of ongoing support from their backers.
And do we know how many of these ATACMS missiles they have, and whether they might be able to get more before the transition in Washington?
Not really. These are kinds of details that tend to be held quite closely because of their obvious operational sensitivity. We do know that the U.S. previously had expressed some concern about not having all that many to offer Ukraine in the first place. So it seems logical that supply is going to be limited, and also, of course, because of the limited time frame that Ukraine is looking at between now and the inauguration of Donald Trump. They're going to be under some pressure to sort of use them as quickly as possible.
And if President Trump does come in and cut off these supplies, do you think we'll see European powers continue to do so?
I mean, so far what we can see, the European countries that support Ukraine have expressed their staunch desire to continue, an intention of continuing that support. So I don't think that they're going to pull back. But the big question is, how much support will they be able to provide to fill the gap that would be left if the U.S. either drastically reduced or totally cut off its support? And, the Europeans altogether couldn't fill that gap. But the question is, how far they could go towards it, what creative solutions there could be, and how, the Ukrainians might be able to get around such a cutoff if it were to happen.
And overnight, there was news that President Biden had agreed to ship anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine to try and help them defend their territory from that increasing Russian incursion in the east of them gaining land. I mean, how risky is this as a move? The US is one of the very few countries that still isn't signed up to anti-landmine treaties.
Well, I think landmines have been one of the key instruments that have been used both by Ukrainian and by Russian forces, and actually much more extensively by Russian forces during this war. And, as you say, one of the really important sort of dynamics of this war is how quickly and how much territory in Ukraine can Russian forces take before everything is sort of brought to a halt, as we anticipate it will be. And so anything that the Ukrainians can do to try and slow down Russian progress and also to try and reduce the really very horrible death toll and injury toll on Ukrainian forces by keeping the Russians at a greater distance, all of those things will be, I think, seized upon by the Ukrainians. But also, it's the sort of thing that the Biden administration can do in the coming weeks and months. It's an element that they can provide, which could make a difference, even a marginal difference on the ground.
And turning to the Kremlin reaction, how significant, can you explain, the change in the nuclear doctrine and how significant it is?
Sure. So this change has been flagged up for some months now. It's been being discussed. It's been drafted. It's clearly been drafted with the situation of the war in Ukraine in mind. So it explicitly says that Russia could consider using nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state if, i.e. Ukraine, if that non-nuclear state were being actively supported by one or more states with nuclear weapons, so i.e. the US, Britain, France, etc. So it's been crafted in order to send a very specific signal to the international supporters of Ukraine that, Russia is taking this seriously. Oh, don't forget Russia has nuclear weapons. This is becoming very dangerous. So back off and reconsider your position. So that is the big message here. It's not necessarily and almost certainly not at all a direct intention by the Russians to use nuclear weapons. It would be extraordinarily foolish for lots of reasons for them to do that, and it would gain them nothing on the battlefield. But as a rhetorical device, as a signaling device, it potentially still has power, especially against the Biden administration.
And in terms of the use, I mean, President Putin can at times be erratic and emotional. How much of a factoring in is that going to be in the calculation of whether or not he'll use them?
Well, what we've seen from Putin over many years is a real sort of hesitation to act in response to surprises and in response to sudden changes of circumstance. And so it's noticeable that we have not heard directly from Putin since the weekend, since the U.S. Has indicated that it's going to give Ukraine this permission to use its long-range missiles against Russia. We haven't heard directly from Putin. He signed this document, changing the doctrine. Other spokespeople, such as Dmitry Peskov and Sergei Lavrov, have spoken on Putin's behalf, but they have referred back to statements that Putin made back in September. So I think Putin's not giving a lot of new material to his people, and I think he's probably considering his options. In other words, what we have not seen is Putin wildly lash out in a fit of temper, immediately responding to something that happens. He tends to sit back, think about it, and carefully calculate what he's going to do next.
Jenny Mathers, thank you. Still to come in the programme, we'll head to Italy to hear what regional elections could mean for Prime Minister Meloni's government. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me from our Zurich studio is Noelle Salmi, a travel, culture and sustainability writer. Noelle, welcome to the show. What's caught your eye in the papers?
Hi, good morning. Yes, well, one of the things that caught my eye was that in Brazil, while President Lula was presiding over the G20 meeting in Rio yesterday and its conclusion, Brazilian authorities were busy arresting several members of an elite army unit who they accused of planning to assassinate Lula in 2022 before his inauguration. Also, the plans were to assassinate the vice president and the then head of the Superior Electoral Court, who was in charge of the elections.
And how significant a plan was this? Was it credible?
Well, definitely it was credible. They seized documents showing that they had planned to either shoot or poison these men. They had a high level of technical military knowledge. One of the people arrested was a sort of super right, super fan of Bolsonaro, who had been instrumental in setting up the tents around the presidential palace. As you might recall, there was a similar event in Brazil at Lula's inauguration as the storming of the Capitol in the United States. And this all comes under the backdrop of the fact that Bolsonaro is not allowed to run again until 2030, but his supporters have felt emboldened by Trump's presidency election. They're hoping that they can get more interest in their party, more congressmen elected in local elections into Congress, so that they can change the rules to make Bolsonaro eligible to run again in 2026. And keep in mind, Bolsonaro he's personally been charged with trying to write a decree to keep Lula out of power, to organize a coup and ask military leaders for their support. So rough times.
And heading north a bit, this is surprising. Migrants from Mexico and Central America traveling into the US, the rate has sped up, not slowed down since Trump's election, despite his promises for mass deportations.
Yeah, apparently they haven't heard that part of the news. They're only focused on the fact that he's not president yet. And so they are rushing to get into the country while Biden is still president. It doesn't seem that the U.S. administration helped things by allowing since this summer, they've been allowing people to apply for humanitarian visa through an application process run inside Mexico at one of 8 border points. And those 8 border points have become inundated. People wait around, according to El País, Mexico. They wait around for 7-8 months, desperate, and they start getting preyed on by criminals who offer to take them over the border. Prices have increased for that. They kidnap them. The price to release a kidnappee has increased. So it's really quite become a mess.
And turning now closer to where you are, Swiss mountain villages, they want to be saved for the good of residents and the country.
So Switzerland, unsurprisingly, located in the Alps, has a lot of mountain towns have been at risk for tectonic movement for a long time. And on Sunday, 80 residents of the village of Brienz in the canton of Graubünden, that's also where St. Moritz is, they had to abandon their home, threatened by the avalanche of falling debris. There's about 1.2 million cubic meters of rock debris that threatened the 80-person town. But the interesting thing is this is not the only town that faces this threat, and the question is, how do Swiss authorities respond to this? There is currently a $40 million Swiss franc project to create a drainage tunnel that will protect the town. This was reported in the Tagesanzeiger, but the NZZ wonders, wouldn't it just be cheaper to pay the 80 residents each $500,000 to $500,000 francs to move on somewhere else? So at the same time, there are plans to move the residents to other villages. And it's sort of an ongoing question, worsened by climate change, as to whether you pay money to save mountain towns or relocate people. And what does this mean for the fabric of Swiss identity?
It's a tricky one because there's huge costs involved for, a very small town. But these are very historic little towns, aren't they?
They are, and the paper quotes a director of cultures for the Alps at the University of Lucerne who says it's really, it's very much a psychic question for Swiss people. The mountain towns are part of the fabric of Switzerland and part of the idea of Switzerland, and also it's really psychologically disruptive for people, obviously, to have to leave their historic homes. So it's an ongoing question. In this case of this town, there is a railway nearby, which needs to be protected. So there's a little more economic
justification.
Impetus, yes.
And finally, New York is trying to become an oyster capital again.
It's kind of interesting. Over the last 10 years, the Billion Oyster Project has been working to bring oysters back to New York. So way back when maybe 200 years ago, 300 years ago, oysters, just the entire East Coast of the United States was oysters. People ate oysters all the time. My great-grandparents were oyster farmers in Connecticut. The Thanksgiving recipe that my mother learned when she moved from Uruguay was oyster stuffing. But pollution has pretty much brought the end of the oyster farms. But after the 2012 hurricane in New York, some environmentalists realized that oysters are actually really, really good for the environment. And they've added in New York 150 million larvae across 20 acres of the harbor since starting. They're nowhere near their billion oysters yet, but already they're seeing health in the oysters, and there is interest from other countries around the world, including Hong Kong, since they are so good for the they clean the water, basically.
Noelle Salmi, thank you. Now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Biden has agreed to give Ukraine anti-personnel landmines in an attempt to slow Russian troops who've been steadily advancing in Ukraine's eastern regions over recent months. Overnight, both Ukraine and Russia reported major drone attacks. Separately, the US Embassy has closed in Kyiv due to specific information of a significant air attack today. President-elect Trump has traveled to Texas with Elon Musk to watch the 6th test launch of a SpaceX Starship spacecraft. Musk's venture was attempting to again catch the rocket booster in a chopstick maneuver on its return to Earth. However, an issue meant it was forced to splash down in the Gulf of Mexico. Jimmy Lai, one of Hong Kong's most influential pro-democracy figures, is taking the stand today in a national security trial that may see him sentenced to life imprisonment. The 76-year-old founder of the now-defunct Apple Daily tabloid is accused of colluding with foreign forces in using his media platform to oppose the Hong Kong government. And Rafael Nadal's illustrious tennis career has come to an end, as Spain lost to the Netherlands in an emotional Davis Cup match on Tuesday night. Nadal, who has won 22 Grand Slam titles, recently announced the tournament would be the last of his 20-year professional career. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, whilst Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been at the G20 in Brazil, back home her right-wing coalition has been struggling in regional elections. And as the leader of the second biggest manufacturer in Europe, she's also having to brace for the prospect of Trump tariffs hampering exports to the United States. Monocle's Anita Riota joins us now. Anita, firstly, what happened in these regional elections?
So, Prime Minister Meloni's right-wing coalition suffered losses in Emilia-Romagna and Umbria, two regions in northern Italy. And that's sort of a rarity for her since she came into power in 2022. Since then, her right-wing bloc has won 9 regional elections, and up until this week's elections, the left had only won 1. Now, both regions have historically been strongholds for the left. Emilia-Romagna has been governed by the left since World War II, and it came as a really big electoral shock when the right won Umbria in 2019. But this week, the left regained control of Umbria with a razor-thin margin of 51.5% of the vote, and it outperformed its performance in 2020 in Emilia-Romagna. So it's an important win for the left-wing coalition, but it's also an important loss for Meloni's alliance.
And is this just a bit of midterm blues, or has the left made a strategic pivot to be successful again?
Yeah, so it's important to note that the left-wing coalition has been calling this a victory of cohesion. And I don't think it's just a nicety. I think it's actually the truth here. Left-wing candidates in both regions only won because the left presented itself in full force. That means that the coalition was comprised of Partito Democratico, the Democratic Party, centrist parties led by Matteo Renzi and Carlo Calenda, the Five Star Movement, and the Greens. In contrast, in another regional election in Liguria recently, which was a special election triggered by the resignation of the right-wing president there due to a slew of scandals, but that's sort of another conversation. The left-wing candidate lost again by a very small margin, but it's because the leaders of this coalition were squabbling amongst themselves, and the centrist parties ended up withdrawing themselves, so they lost out those votes. So it's becoming increasingly clear that the left hasn't completely lost out in Italy. They are finding some footing 2 years after suffering a pretty big loss to Giorgia Meloni and her allies, but they're seeing that if they come together and they are able to put aside some of these more personally, I think, personality feuds that they're having, they are able to win.
And how stable is Meloni's coalition? Are there more elections looming?
So I think when she was first elected 2 years ago, that was the question on everyone's lips. Is this right-wing coalition going to be able to ride out the full 5 years together? And so far, they've actually been quite successful, and I think they've exceeded expectations in that regard. There definitely have been notable disputes, primarily and most importantly over Russia, but also some domestic issues. There's been a big conversation in Italy about the citizenship status, about children born in the country to non-Italian parents that got a lot of headlines, a lot of media attention. But importantly, from this week's election, I would note that Matteo Salvini's Lega was outperformed by Forza Italia, another right-wing coalition member. I think this is important because I personally see Matteo Salvini as Meloni's biggest domestic liability. He's volatile, he's attention hungry, and maybe most importantly, he's sort of on the decline. You have to remember this is a man that 2 years ago was co-prime minister. He was a rising star on the right. And since then, he's seen his party's vote share plummet. His job title is far less impressive and not even the cabinet position that he had been initially gunning for. So I think we have to keep an eye on what he's now going to be willing to do to get that vote share back up.
Turning to the economy, as mentioned, Italy could take a substantial hit if Trump does impose his muted tariffs. How damaging would that be?
It would be really damaging. I think, obviously, Meloni has had a good relationship with Trump in the past, but these tariffs could be a really big blow domestically. Take even just Emilia-Romagna, one of the regions that had their elections this week. They produce both Ferrari sports cars and world-famous Parmigiano-Reggiano Parmesan cheese, and so exports for them are clearly massively important. As you mentioned in your intro, Italy is the second biggest manufacturing power in Europe. So for them to face tariffs of this size, it would be an economic disaster. And so then I think, Meloni's sort of alliance or ability to get along well with Trump would absolutely be tested.
And she seemingly has a strong relationship with Elon Musk. Could that help her?
That's an interesting one. When Trump was just elected recently, she congratulated him and her good friend Elon Musk. But since then, they've strayed into hairier territory with Musk taking it upon himself to weigh in on Italy's new migrant deal with Albania that's faced all types of legal troubles. And he made a comment saying that the Italian judges blocking this migrant deal should step down. The Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, who really never gets involved in these sort of political spats, intervened and censored him and said, leave Italian issues to Italian voters and politicians. So maybe even before they've taken office, this very positive relationship is under strain.
Anita Ryota, thank you. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, New Zealand, one of the world's most stable democracies, is not somewhere you normally see scenes of heated political protest, but an attempt by the government to change the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, the country's founding document between British colonisers and Maori people, has seen tens of thousands of Kiwis marching in the streets and politicians demonstrating via the haka in Parliament. Joining us now is Natalia Sunderland, a reporter covering New Zealand. Natalia, firstly, for anyone not aware, what does this 184-year-old treaty ensure?
Well, the treaty ensures partnership between the Crown and Māori, the indigenous population of New Zealand. The issues around the treaty is that there are two versions of it. So in the Te Reo Māori version of it, it gives the indigenous people of New Zealand self-governance and rights to their lands. In the English version, it doesn't say that. So the issue around the treaty is that there is a lot to be interpreted from the original document, and that is why in the 1970s there were principles created to draw a bridge between those two versions. They're not in law, they're not enshrined, so they're left up to interpretation by the courts for a case-by-case basis. So when it comes to anything to do with land issues, where Māori have rights to that land or claim that they have rights to that land, that then goes to the court. So if the Crown, say, wanted to sell Crown land, that would then need to go to the Waitangi Tribunal, which was also set up in the 1970s, or to the court to get them to decide, based on their interpretation, using those principles created in the 70s, whether that is breaching the treaty or not.
So why is the government attempting this change now? Is it because things are being tied up in bureaucracy, or it's sort of inconsistent in how it's being interpreted and applied?
It's pure politics. So the party that's bringing it forward is a Libertarian party. They're very much for less government. They have brought in a regulation ministry to try and reduce government. So they see the treaty as too much bureaucracy in New Zealand. They see it getting in the way of their time in government. So what the treaty does for short-term governments, so we've got 3-year term, is it stalls legislation getting through, because if you did want to sell land, which could benefit for more libertarian governments who are wanting to make money, they would then need to go through the court process. So that stalls legislation. So what ACT is wanting to do is to take that process away, giving government more power. The only issue around that lawyers have highlighted is that we have no upper house. We have no written constitution. So the courts act as a check and balance of the government so that they can't come in and make sweeping changes.
And was this in their manifesto, or has this been a surprise?
They campaigned on this, so it's not a surprise. The surprise that came last week, which has drawn so much attention, is they brought the first reading forward a little bit. But the hikoi, the protest that we saw last week, had been planned.
And in terms of the reaction in the sort of Maori community, but also non-Maori New Zealanders, what are they making of this?
I think there's a mixed bag. I think the majority see this as creating division in the country, and in a time we don't need it, especially during a cost of living crisis. I think a lot of people don't also understand the background and the history and the complexity of the treaty and how government works around making decisions based on the treaty. What is working for the ACT Party at the moment is that they're using the line that if you aren't Māori, you are a second-class citizen, and the treaty gets in the way. And if we change the principles and make everyone equal and give the power to decision-making solely to the government, then everyone will be equal. But for Māori, for them, this is seen as breaking that contract that they signed in 1840, not seeing them as partners any longer. So they are wanting the government to hold up that contract that they signed all those years ago, and also to be consulted because they see themselves as partners having signed the treaty.
And do they have the votes to get this through? And is there any sort of level of polling in terms of where the population is on the changes?
Not anything recently. There has been polling on the possible referendum that could happen, and that's pretty split, 30-30, 30-30-30 actually. So you've got 30% wanting it to, over 30% wanting to have the referendum, 30% not wanting it, and then the rest saying that they're undecided. In terms of it getting passed in the House, it's unlikely. It will go to Select Committee, which will take about 6 months, where they'll hear from the public and experts, write a report and then send it to the House for the MPs to vote on there. But the government, the majority, the National Party, they've said they won't back it. To get the coalition deal across the line so they could get power last year, they signed an agreement saying that they would support the bill this far. But from here on out, there is no support for the bill.
Natalia Sunderland, thank you very much. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. we know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to the Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 16:44 in Tokyo, 8:44 in Zurich. Now, over the past few years, you will have noticed the growing range of Japanese matcha tea products in cafes and grocery stores. The trend took off as influencers popularised the traditional tea, touting its benefits to health-conscious consumers. But the boom has led to problems, with manufacturers no longer able to keep up with demand. Well, we're joined now by Fiona Wilson, Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief and Senior Asia Editor. Fiona, for those who don't know how matcha is produced, it goes some way to explaining why there might be supply issues.
Hi, yes, this is such an interesting, very Japanese story. So matcha is the ground green tea. It comes in a powder form. In Japan, people really mostly have been using it for tea ceremonies. It's an essential part of the tea ceremony. You use a little whisk and you whip up this frothy, very rich green tea. It's quite bitter almost, an acquired taste, I would say. But overseas, and even here to a certain extent, you're seeing the rise of the matcha latte, these matcha drinks, matcha ice cream. And it's made from this very, it's a specific way it's processed. It's not like other loose teas. And yes, you're right. These companies just simply can't keep up with demand now.
Because it's a very delicate process, isn't it? It involves sort of hand-picking these certain leaves.
Yeah, you're right. It's hand-picked, but it's even more complicated. I mean, the leaves have to be shielded from the sun before they're picked for about 3 weeks. And the idea is that if they're shielded from the sun, they then have to work harder to produce chlorophyll, which people think, makes the tea richer. It's got a tastier. People talk about, umami, this word you hear people using now. And it then has to be handled in a slightly different way. It's de-stemmed, it's steamed, and when it's flat, then it's ground in a granite mill. And it's just not really lending itself to, huge quantities and vast production numbers. And I think what you're seeing is that people are coming to Japan. They want to experience authentic premium matcha. And at the moment, it's in short supply.
There are some plans underway, though, to scale up the production. How are they going to do this?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a long process. I mean, most of the people making matcha, it's really concentrated in a couple of areas in Japan. One of them is Uji. This very attractive. There's a town and there are a lot of these tea gardens all around it. But it also has this very, very famous temple called Byodoin. So you get a lot of tourists coming to that town and they all want their souvenir matcha tea. Now, these are the companies that are saying, we can't keep up. These are family businesses, and they're not used to producing in great quantities. And what you're noticing is that, some of these big sellers, these famous tea shops, are having to put up notices on the internet saying, we simply don't have enough, we're out of stocks on some lines, and we can't sell overseas, or we're limiting quantities that we're seeing overseas. I think what they will do is they will, more people will be involved in the production, but it's never going to be a massive production, and it's simply the way the tea is cultivated. There's a limit to how much they can increase this, particularly high grade. I mean, a lot of people are drinking matcha tea that is not actually made from tencha is the word they use to describe the leaves that are specifically for matcha. And, I think that's very unique to Japan. If you go overseas, you'll find you might be drinking matcha that's not really made from such a high quality tea. This is this very specific, really, really tasty tea. Japanese people would be able to tell the difference. But I think, there is going to be a limit to what they can do. But in fact, the whole thing, has been a big subject here. But in fact, our own Nick Moniz sent me a photo from Australia of a tea shop in Sydney, which said, sorry, we can't sell green tea because of the matcha shortage in Japan. So clearly the problem is going global.
And are Japanese people sort of surprised or delighted or bemused by how popular matcha has become overseas?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a certain amount of pride, and it's wonderful for the growers. The interest in green tea, it's not a bad thing. People are really happy about it. I think that the problem is that, for, say, people who like to use certain kinds of green tea for tea ceremony, if they can't get the green tea they like, they will be a bit upset. But no, I think people, obviously, they've been aware of the health benefits of green tea for a long time here. It may be one of the reasons that people in Japan live so long, that they do drink so much green tea. People think it speeds up your metabolism. It's supposed to have all these antioxidants, all these health-giving properties. So I think, there's a sense that, yes, of course it's good, and we're happy that people are interested. I think this incredible tourism boom that Japan is experiencing is really contributing to the current shortage, because people are coming here. They're going to all these cafes. They're trying out tea ceremonies in a more sort of informal way than a Japanese person might, and they're really enjoying it. So, it is good for business. It's good for these very old tea businesses, but they're trying to manage it to keep the loyal customers, the tea ceremony people. They've got to keep them happy and keep the visitors happy too.
And that's prompted my last question. This boom in tourism that Japan's been experiencing because of the very favourable exchange rate, how are they coping with it? Because it has caused some problems along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big subject. Definitely, I think Japan is adjusting to its sort of new position as a place for mass tourism. And I think the absolute sort of drop in the yen, particularly against the dollar, I mean, it's dropped by half, means that there are just far, far more visitors here than I've ever seen in my many years in Japan. So I think that is a bit of an adjustment. And people want to experience Japanese food and, drink tea. They're really interested in that side of Japanese culture. They're interested in traditional culture too, which also impacts tea. And I think, it's great in a way, but there has been a period of adjustment. And we're seeing, it's difficult for these very small restaurants that they do slightly struggle to cope, and they want to keep their own regular customers happy as well. A lot about relationships in Japan with food. People like to know the people they're serving, or at least be able to offer them a proper, conversation, proper service. And I think they do slightly struggle if there's a language barrier.
Fiona Wilson, thank you for joining us. Now, the Monocle Cafe is still here in London under refurbishment. It will open next month, but we do have a temporary pop-up truck parked right here at Midori House on Dorset Street, where you can get great coffee, pastries, and, of course, matcha tea as well. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally on the show, it's time to talk theatre. And for that, I'm joined in the studio by Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times. Matt, great to see you again.
Thank you.
Firstly, Steve Coogan treading the boards in London.
Yes, a rare stage appearance from him. He has had a long obsession with Peter Sellers. And so what better way to express that than to do a stage version of Dr. Strangelove, the Kubrick movie associated with Peter Sellers. I can't say this really landed for me. I mean, there's a tendency now for musicals to be adapted from movies, and now we've got plays adapted from movies, and this doesn't really add much to a legendary 1964 original. It's quite lumbering. Coogan doesn't seem equally at home across 4 roles, whereas Peter Sellers in the movie had 3. The best occupancy for Coogan is indeed the title role as Dr. Strangelove, where he's like this mad, demented camp figure who gets the word NASA sort of confused with Nazi, and he occupies kind of a realm of his own. The rest of it really struggles to sustain momentum on a rather remarkably ugly set as well. So I think if you're a Coogan buff, fine. I think if you're not, it's a bit of a slog.
Mm-hmm. And she swapped Paris for London. Lily Collins is in a new play, Barcelona.
Yes, this is interesting. This is one of these plays that parcels out revelation very neatly. Sort of every 15 minutes, there's a new sort of, oh my heavens, that keeps you going across one act at no interval. She and the Spanish actor Alvaro Morte, who's very good, by the way, he's excellent. They meet at a pub or a bar in Barcelona. They come back to what you think is his flat, but possibly isn't. And they have a very lustful initiation that actually then deepens as the night turns to morning. And by the time the play is over, both of them have changed their outlooks on life. I can't really say much more than that. It seems to trade on Lily Collins's Emily in Paris persona. I have to say, as an American abroad myself, I rather chafed at the ugly American abroad image promulgated in this play. But you know what, Vinny? It was ever thus.
I mean, she's sort of not really stepping too far away from her sort of most famous role, Emily in Paris. But does Lily Collins, I mean, lots of American actors have tried the London stage and they don't quite cut it. Does she cut it?
Well, you know what she's done is she's chosen something sort of adjacent to what we would expect, but just that little bit sufficiently different that you think, oh, there's an actress. So it's a canny choice of play. It's a two-hander by the American Bess Wool that has been seen in the States before, although never in New York. I would imagine the producers here are aiming to take it to Broadway. My feeling is it's a bit slight for that.
Mm. And the musical version of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, another, you mentioned there, movies getting musicals. Yeah. That's the latest one. It follows Mrs. Doubtfire and Back to the Future in London.
Yeah, well, this is my pick of this particular crop. And, of course, people remember the Brad Pitt, Cate Blanchett film from 2008, a long while ago now. But actually, the source for both the film and the stage musical is a story by F. Scott Fitzgerald dating back to the 1920s about a man who lives his life in reverse. He's born elderly and dies in infancy. And the movie really put it out of your head because this has been entirely displaced by the creators, Jethro Compton and Darren Clark, to Cornwall. It has a very sort of distinctly Southern English flavor. The score is beautifully kind of flecked with sea shanties, and it's very, very evocative of the place. John Dalglish plays the part that Brad Pitt played in the film, the title character, with real simplicity. It's not about changing costume or hairstyle, whatever. It's about something interior and how you discover along the way that really age is truly just a number. It's sort of who you are at whatever point in life that matters. And I have to say, I saw it with a very kind of emotionally sort of indrawn friend of mine. And near the end, I heard this kind of peculiar sound. And I looked to my left and it was him snuffling. So I thought that was the best review that the show could have.
Mm. And finally, you cannot escape at the moment marketing and press for the Wicked film. It feels like the Hollywood studios think if this musical doesn't work, then we're not making musicals for a long while. You've seen it. What did you think?
That's a very good, your description of it there is very good. Everything about this movie feels big, grand, and I have to say rather bloated and self-important. If you like the show, as I do up to a point, the songs are all there. They're beautifully delivered by Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo, who are the two leads. But there's something strange about the entire enterprise, which has taken a 2-hour and 45-minute show, and this movie is the same length, but this is only part one. So the movie ends at the end of the first act of the show.
So Defying Gravity is the big
and then
finish.
We have to wait a year. It's a year-long interval. That's a very long interval before we see how it concludes. I mean, My Fair Lady and Carousel and Oliver, to pick other successful movies of stage musicals, they didn't need to be in two parts. Why does this one? What's interesting about this, I have to say, is that in a way they could never have expected, it sort of tallies with the current climate. The Cynthia Erivo character of Elphaba is really ramped up in this version as a sort of activist who wants to affect change. She's willing to do battle with Jeff Goldblum's wizard. She's not going to take anything lying down. She's going to defy gravity. And particularly in the wake of the recent election in the States, you feel, and of course Cynthia Erivo, an actress of color and a very powerful actress of color, all of these sort of give gravity, forgive the word, to the material that I'm not sure it would have had in other circumstances. So who would have thought that Wicked has, against the odds, ended up as almost a political parable?
Interesting. And I mean, there's a test, to borrow another song, it's popularity. If it's popular, I mean, it'll seem like the gamble paid off to split it into two, but it is a risk because we've seen musical films in theatre bomb recently. Joker, Folie à Deux, the Mean Girls movie, musical. It's been a bit of a bad time for them.
Well, and also the received wisdom about sequels or continuations, I guess in this case, in film is that 9 times out of 10, they don't work. The Godfather Part 2, one of the great sequels of all time, is the exception exception that proves the rule. So it does sort of speak of a certain amount of hubris, I think, on the part of Universal and the people behind it. We will see in a year.
Matt Wolf, thank you very much for joining us here on The Globalist. That's all we have time for in today's programme. Thank you to our producers, Anita Riota and Laura Kramer, our researcher, Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager, Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday London time. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for tuning in.